Something doesn't add up here. One gas field, one warning, one post, and suddenly the world's energy map looks like a battlefield. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work. That support helps us keep producing sharp, honest analysis on the political and economic forces that are reshaping your world. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Donald Trump's latest warning on Iran and Qatar is not just another explosive headline from a wartime news cycle. It is not random. It is not emotional noise. And it is not just about the Middle East. What he did was draw a new line of power around one of the most important energy arteries on Earth. His message was simple on the surface: Israel will not strike Iran's South Pars gas field again, but if Iran attacks Qatari energy sites again, the United States will. That sounds like deterrence. But beneath that sentence is something far bigger, far darker, and far more consequential for the global economy. Because once an American president publicly connects U.S. military force to the defense of Qatari energy infrastructure, the war is no longer confined to missiles, militias, or maps. It becomes a struggle over the plumbing of the global economy. And that changes everything. Let's be clear about what Trump is really doing here. He is trying to restore order after order has already broken down. South Pars was struck. Ras Laffan was hit. Gulf energy infrastructure is no longer sitting outside the combat zone. The old assumption, that certain energy assets were too critical, too dangerous, too globally connected to be attacked directly, has already been shattered. Trump is stepping into that breach and saying, from this point forward, this is the red line. That may sound strong. It may even sound stabilizing. But it also tells us something alarming. The White House now understands that the war has entered a new phase, one where the next strike is not just measured in casualties or damage on the ground, but in oil prices, LNG flows, inflation pressure, shipping insurance, and political shockwaves across democracies already under strain. Trump is speaking to multiple audiences at once. He is speaking to Iran, of course, warning Tehran not to hit Qatar again. He is speaking to Israel, signaling that Washington wants to stop further attacks on South Pars unless Iran escalates first. He is speaking to Qatar and the Gulf states, telling them that the United States sees their energy infrastructure as strategically important enough to defend. He is speaking to markets, trying to put a lid on panic. And he is speaking to American voters, whether they realize it or not, because every move in this conflict is now flowing back into the cost of living at home. That is what makes this moment so important. Trump is not just threatening force. He is attempting to manage an energy war with political messaging. And that is a dangerous game, because messaging does not always control outcomes. Sometimes it only reveals how fragile the system has become. There is also a major contradiction at the heart of his statement. Trump says the United States knew nothing about the Israeli strike on South Pars. If that is true, then Washington's control over this war is weaker than many assumed. That would mean one of America's closest partners launched a strike on one of the world's most sensitive energy assets without meaningful U.S. control. That is not strength. That is a warning sign. But if it is not true, if Washington did know, or if it quietly approved the operation, then Trump is not clarifying policy. He is managing political exposure. In that case, the statement is not just deterrence. It is narrative discipline. It is an attempt to calm markets, shield Qatar from the appearance of complicity, and create room for the United States to look like the stabilizing power after being tied, directly or indirectly, to the action that helped trigger the next phase of escalation. Either way, the structure of power looks shaky. Either the US is not fully in control of its side of the escalation ladder, or it is trying to hide how involved it really is. Neither option inspires confidence. And confidence is everything in an energy crisis. Because energy markets do not only price supply. They price fear. They price uncertainty. They price the possibility that the next strike could hit a refinery, a shipping route, a processing facility, or a major export terminal. Once the world sees South Pars and Ras Laffan in the line of fire, traders do not wait for total destruction. They begin repricing the future immediately. That is why a single statement from Trump matters so much. It is not merely political theater. It is part of the market signal. And here is the deeper strategic issue. Trump is trying to freeze one escalation channel while keeping another fully loaded. He is telling Israel to stop hitting South Pars, at least for now. But he is also telling Iran that if Qatar is hit again, the United States itself will unleash overwhelming force. That is not peace. That is conditional containment. It is an effort to narrow the war's next trigger while preserving maximum coercive leverage. Historically, that kind of strategy can work for a short time. It can buy space. It can impose discipline. It can delay a broader rupture. But it rarely resolves the underlying problem when too many red lines have already been crossed. And in this case, they have. The conflict has already touched core energy infrastructure. Gulf states are already under pressure. Markets are already nervous. Hormuz is already a global choke point under stress. In that environment, one warning from Washington may shape the next move, but it cannot reverse the logic that has already been unleashed. And that logic is brutal. If Iran's energy core is vulnerable, Tehran may believe Gulf energy systems must become vulnerable too. If the Gulf feels exposed, it moves closer to Washington. If Washington's credibility gets tied to defending those assets, then the United States gets pulled deeper into a conflict it says it wants to manage. That is how regional wars become systemic crises. Not all at once. But step by step. Target by target. Message by message. Miscalculation by miscalculation. For Americans, the most important thing to understand is this: this is not far away anymore. This is not just about Tehran, Doha, or the Persian Gulf. This is about whether energy inflation becomes entrenched, whether shipping costs rise further, whether airlines, freight, and household budgets absorb another shock, and whether the United States is drifting into a deeper security commitment under the cover of deterrence language. Trump may believe he is drawing a clean line. In reality, he is drawing that line across one of the most unstable intersections on Earth: war, energy, money, and prestige. And history tells us that once a conflict reaches that intersection, the line does not hold easily. Because this is no longer just a war over missiles, militias, and maps. It is now a war over the pipes, ports, tankers, and terminals that keep the modern world running. And once that machinery becomes a target, every sentence from Washington stops being just politics. It becomes part of the battlefield. Why South Pars is not just another target. South Pars is not just another target because South Pars is not just another piece of energy infrastructure. It is one of the pressure valves of the modern Middle East. When that field was struck, the meaning went far beyond fire, smoke, or immediate operational damage. It told every government, every trader, every military planner, and every household watching energy prices that one of the most sensitive assets in the regional order was no longer protected by the old rules. That is the core issue here. In ordinary war reporting, a gas field can sound technical, distant, almost sterile. But South Pars is not sterile. It is political. It is strategic. It is psychological. It is part of the largest natural gas reservoir in the world, shared by Iran and Qatar, and that fact alone makes it unlike almost any other target in this war. What was hit was not simply a production site. What was hit was a nerve center tied to national resilience, state prestige, and the credibility of the energy system surrounding the Persian Gulf. For Iran, South Pars is deeply bound up with internal stability. A large share of the gas associated with that field supports domestic consumption. That means this is not mainly about export revenue in the narrow sense. This is about what keeps the internal machine running. In practical terms, that includes electricity, industry, and the broader confidence that the state can continue functioning under pressure. When a country's strategic energy base is exposed, the damage is never measured only in physical losses. It is measured in the message sent to the leadership, the military, the bureaucracy, and the public. If this can be touched, then very little is truly off limits. That is why the South Pars strike mattered so much more than its immediate scale. Even if only a relatively limited section was hit, the larger effect was systemic. The attack broke an assumption that had quietly shaped the conflict until now. That assumption was simple: core energy infrastructure was too dangerous to place squarely in the center of the war, because the second-order consequences would spread too far, too fast, and too unpredictably. Once South Pars was struck, that assumption collapsed. And when assumptions collapse in an energy war, markets move first, diplomacy follows late, and escalation becomes harder to control. History gives us a clear warning on this point. Whenever energy infrastructure becomes a battlefield, the conflict stops behaving like a normal military contest. In the late stages of the Iran-Iraq War, tanker attacks showed how quickly local fighting could infect global shipping and oil security. In the 1973 oil shock, the world learned that energy can carry geopolitical conflict straight into inflation, recession, and political instability far from the place where the crisis began. What matters is not only the physical asset. What matters is the role that asset plays inside the wider structure of power. And South Pars sits inside that structure in a uniquely dangerous way. Militarily, it is a high-value vulnerability. Economically, it is a confidence anchor. Politically, it is part of Iran's image of endurance. Strategically, it is linked to Qatar through geography, which means a strike there immediately raises the risk of widening the crisis beyond the original line of conflict. That is exactly what makes it such a combustible target. A hit on South Pars does not stay in one lane. It spreads across several at once. There is also a deeper market logic here that many people miss. Commodity markets do not just react to lost supply. They react to the destruction of boundaries. Once traders see that one of the world's most sensitive gas assets can be attacked, they no longer price the market as if stability is the default setting. They start pricing fear, replacement difficulty, repair risk, insurance exposure, political retaliation, and the possibility that the next strike could be worse. In plain English, South Pars did not have to be fully destroyed to shake the system. It only had to become targetable. That is why this site carries such extraordinary symbolic force. A strike on South Pars humiliates Tehran because it shows that even its premier strategic assets are exposed. But it also pressures everyone else, because it introduces a new question into the region's political economy. If South Pars can be hit, why not the next refinery, terminal, or export hub? That question alone is enough to alter behavior. It changes how governments think, how shipping firms calculate, how insurers price risk, and how rival states prepare for the next move. For the American audience, the essential point is this: South Pars may be in Iran, but the consequences of targeting it do not stay there. Once a field like this enters the strike zone, the impact travels through energy prices, inflation expectations, investment risk, and strategic uncertainty. It crosses oceans quickly. It lands in family budgets. And it starts to shape the political choices of governments that may not have fired a single shot. That is why South Pars is not just another target. It is the kind of target that changes the grammar of a war. Once it was hit, the conflict stopped being mainly about battlefield pressure and became something more dangerous, a contest over whether the world's energy architecture itself can survive the escalation. Ras Laffan, Qatar, and the Gulf's forced awakening. Ras Laffan changed the meaning of this war because it proved something the region had hoped to avoid for as long as possible. Once core energy infrastructure starts taking direct fire, this is no longer a contained military confrontation. It becomes a test of whether the Gulf can still function as the stable engine room of the global economy. That is the real significance of what happened in Qatar. Ras Laffan was not hit as an isolated industrial target. It was hit as part of a larger message, and that message was meant for every capital, every market, and every government still pretending this conflict could be kept in a narrow box. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Ras Laffan actually is. It is not just another facility on the coast. It is one of the central processing and export hubs in the global LNG system. It is tied directly to Qatar's role as one of the world's most important energy suppliers. When missile strikes cause fires and extensive damage there, the issue is not only what burned that day. The issue is what the strike tells the world about the vulnerability of a system that millions of people depend on without ever seeing it. That system powers homes, factories, shipping routes, and national energy strategies across multiple continents. And that is why the attack on Ras Laffan was a shock of a different order. South Pars exposed the vulnerability of Iran's energy core. Ras Laffan exposed the vulnerability of the wider Gulf order. The war crossed a boundary. Iran was no longer signaling only to Israel or even only to the United States. Tehran was demonstrating that if its own strategic energy base could be touched, then the wider network surrounding it could be made to feel pain as well. That is not just retaliation. That is strategic expansion. It is a way of forcing states that wanted distance from the war to feel its cost directly. For Qatar, that creates a brutal reality. Doha did not launch the strike on South Pars. It was not the initiating actor in that escalation. But geography and energy integration erased the comfort of non-participation. This is one of the hardest truths in modern geopolitical conflict. Proximity to a strategic system can make a state a target even when it is not the primary aggressor. Qatar suddenly found itself in the position of being punished for a conflict dynamic it did not control, but one that runs straight through the infrastructure on which its national power depends. That helps explain the sharpness of Qatar's response. When a state says an attack on its energy infrastructure is a direct threat to national security and regional stability, that is not diplomatic exaggeration. It is an accurate reading of the stakes. For Qatar, Ras Laffan is not only about export revenue. It is about national relevance, strategic leverage, and long-term political standing. Damage there is not simply damage to property. It is damage to confidence, and confidence is one of the most valuable forms of power in the energy business. The same awakening is now spreading across the Gulf states. The UAE has already seen the pressure move closer to its own energy sites. Saudi Arabia has made clear that trust in Iran is breaking down and that military options remain on the table. That is how regional balances shift. Slowly at first, then all at once. For years, Gulf states tried to preserve room for maneuver, trying to defend themselves without being dragged fully into direct confrontation. But once missiles, drones, and falling debris begin reaching energy facilities, civilian sites, and strategic corridors, that middle ground starts to disappear. This is where the logic of horizontal escalation becomes crucial. When a state cannot impose enough pain on its main enemy through the central battlefield alone, it starts widening the map. It targets the economic architecture around the war. It aims at pressure points connected to allies, trade routes, supply chains, and political confidence. That appears to be the logic here. Iran is signaling that support for military pressure on Tehran will carry consequences not only in Iran, but across the Gulf energy system itself. But there is a strategic risk in that approach that Tehran cannot ignore. Pressure can produce fear, but it can also produce alignment. A Gulf state that wants to avoid direct confrontation may decide it no longer has that luxury. A regional actor that once balanced carefully may move closer to Washington out of necessity rather than choice. In that sense, attacks on energy infrastructure can harden the very coalition they are meant to intimidate. There is also a deeper financial layer to this story. Energy markets do not judge a place like Ras Laffan only by what was damaged on one night. They judge it by what the attack says about future reliability. LNG is a business built not just on production, but on trust, timing, contracts, insurance, and operational continuity. A strike on a major LNG hub raises questions that no military spokesman can answer quickly. How long will repairs take? Will shippers hesitate? Will insurers reprice? Will buyers look for alternatives? Will future deliveries carry hidden risk? In modern commodity systems, uncertainty itself behaves like a form of damage. That is why the attack on Ras Laffan was so consequential. It told the world that the Gulf's most valuable energy infrastructure is no longer protected by distance, importance, or economic logic alone. And once that truth sinks in, the political consequences spread quickly. Gulf states harden. Markets reprice. Outside powers lean in. The war stops looking regional and starts looking systemic. What happened in Qatar was not just a strike. It was the forced awakening of the Gulf. And once a region built on energy confidence begins to doubt its own protection, the entire world starts paying attention. Hormuz, the choke point that turns regional war into global shock. The Strait of Hormuz is where distance dies. It is the place where Americans are told a war is far away, and then suddenly discover they are paying for it at the gas pump, at the airport, in freight costs, in food prices, and in the quiet anxiety that spreads through markets when the world's most important shipping corridor begins to look like a combat zone. That is what makes Hormuz different. It is not just a map reference in the Persian Gulf. It is the narrow passage where regional violence is converted into global economic pressure. Too many people still talk about Hormuz as if it matters only when it is fully closed. That is a misunderstanding, and it is a dangerous one. In the real world, you do not need a formal blockade to create a shock. You only need to make the route dangerous enough, expensive enough, and unpredictable enough that the system begins to seize up on its own. That is exactly why this waterway has always carried such strategic power. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passes through Hormuz, along with enormous volumes tied to the wider Gulf energy chain. That means even partial disruption can ripple outward with stunning speed. This is not just about ships physically being unable to pass. It is about whether they can pass at a price, with insurance, with crew confidence, with operating predictability, and with enough trust in the corridor to keep global trade moving without panic. Once those conditions begin to break down, the market starts behaving as if the choke point is already compromised. That is the real power of Hormuz. It does not merely move cargo. It moves confidence. And when confidence disappears, the damage spreads faster than any missile. That is why attacks on vessels near the UAE matter so much. Even limited incidents carry strategic weight because they reinforce a larger message: this corridor is under pressure, and the rules of safe passage are weakening. Once that message lands, the economic consequences begin to multiply. Insurers recalculate. Shipping companies delay or reroute. Freight costs rise. Energy traders scramble to secure future supply. Governments move into contingency mode. Buyers start paying more not only for actual scarcity, but for the possibility of future scarcity. That is how a regional war becomes a worldwide tax. This is where military strategy and financial behavior merge into one battlefield. Hormuz is not just contested by missiles or naval threats. It is contested through pricing, probability, and fear. Every signal of danger becomes a force multiplier. Markets do not wait politely for complete destruction before reacting. They move early because the cost of being wrong is too high. If a tanker lane becomes unreliable, even briefly, the system compensates with higher premiums, precautionary buying, and more expensive contracts. That process can push prices upward long before the worst physical disruption arrives. History teaches this lesson repeatedly, and policymakers still act surprised every time. In the 1970s, the world learned that energy insecurity can move through advanced economies like a political contagion. In the tanker war, maritime pressure proved that local combat can destabilize global trade when critical waterways are involved. More recently, supply chain crises showed how fragile efficient systems become once reliability breaks down. Hormuz concentrates all of those lessons into one narrow channel. It is the point where geography gives leverage to those willing to use risk as a weapon. And that is the deeper issue now. Iran does not need to dominate the entire sea lane in conventional military terms to produce global consequences. It only needs to keep the route under enough strain that shipping becomes a gamble and energy markets begin pricing the future through fear. That is why talk of reopening, escorting, or stabilizing traffic through Hormuz is not some technical naval matter. It is a question about whether the modern global economy can still count on one of its most essential arteries. For the United States, this should be understood with absolute clarity. Hormuz is not somebody else's problem. The American economy may not sit on its shores, but it is tied to its function. Energy prices feed into transport costs, manufacturing, agriculture, aviation, logistics, and inflation expectations. That means a stressed Hormuz can erode purchasing power in Ohio, shake investor confidence in New York, and complicate Federal Reserve decisions in Washington. Foreign policy becomes domestic economics the moment this choke point is under threat. There is also a psychological dimension that matters more than officials like to admit. When the public hears that a distant strait is under pressure, the first instinct is to tune out. But markets do not tune out. They understand that modern prosperity depends not just on production, but on uninterrupted flow. Hormuz is one of the places where that flow can be squeezed with maximum effect. It is a lever against the industrial world itself. And that is why this corridor sits at the center of the crisis. It is where a war in the Middle East stops being interpreted as a regional conflict and starts being felt as systemic disorder. The missiles, the ship strikes, the warnings, the military escorts, the insurance spikes, the sudden volatility in crude and gas prices, all of it converges here. Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the pressure point where a regional war begins punishing the entire modern economy, one shipment, one contract, one household budget at a time. The U.S. economic trap, oil, inflation, and the politics of affordability. The real domestic battlefield in this war is not in the desert, not in the Gulf, and not even inside the Situation Room. It is in the monthly budget of the American household. That is where the political truth becomes unavoidable. Because once oil surges, once gasoline prices jump, once shipping costs rise and inflation fears return, no administration gets to hide behind foreign policy language for very long. The war may begin with strategic arguments, military briefings, and presidential warnings. But in the United States, it is judged in the end by what it does to the cost of living. That is the trap now closing around Donald Trump. He has long understood something many politicians learn too late: voters may follow foreign crises with emotion, but they vote through their wallet. That is why affordability has always been more than an economic slogan. It is a theory of political survival. If people feel daily life is under control, they grant leaders more room. If they feel the basics are slipping out of reach, patience disappears fast. And energy is one of the fastest ways for that public trust to collapse. Oil is not just another commodity in the American economy. It is a transmission mechanism. It moves through transportation, logistics, manufacturing, food distribution, aviation, delivery systems, agriculture, and consumer psychology. When oil climbs sharply, it does not stay in one category. It spreads. A rise in crude becomes a rise in gasoline. A rise in gasoline becomes a rise in freight. A rise in freight becomes a rise in groceries, airline tickets, warehouse costs, and small business pressure. Then comes the final stage: people stop asking whether prices are going up. They start assuming they will keep going up. That is when inflation stops being a statistic and becomes a mindset. And once inflation becomes a mindset, politics gets much harder. Because now the administration is not fighting only a price increase. It is fighting a loss of confidence. Consumers begin pulling back. Businesses hesitate on hiring or investment. Markets become more volatile. The Federal Reserve faces a familiar nightmare: growth softens, but inflation stays hot enough to limit easy relief. That is the heart of the stagflation problem, and it is precisely why energy shocks are so politically destructive. They hit quickly, visibly, and across class lines. This is why so many of the administration's responses look weaker than they sound. The Jones Act waiver was presented as action. In reality, it was mostly an attempt to show movement in the face of a structural problem. Emergency reserve releases create headlines, but they do not eliminate geopolitical risk. Looser treatment of Venezuelan supply may add barrels at the margin, but it does not restore trust in threatened infrastructure or a stressed shipping corridor. These moves are tactical pressure valves. They do not solve the deeper crisis, because the deeper crisis is not merely about supply. It is about whether the world believes supply can remain secure. That is the difference between a normal commodity spike and an energy war shock. In a normal spike, policymakers can hope for mean reversion. Demand slows, producers adjust, and prices gradually settle. In a conflict like this, the market is not just reacting to numbers. It is reacting to instability in the architecture itself. Once traders believe that energy hubs, maritime routes, and regional deterrents are all under strain at the same time, prices begin carrying a fear premium. That premium can survive even when governments try to calm markets with policy gestures. For Trump, this creates a deep contradiction. He wants to project strength abroad and control at home. He wants to look decisive in the Middle East while reassuring Americans that the economic fallout will remain manageable. But strength abroad becomes politically expensive when it shows up as fragility in the family budget. That is the problem with wars that collide with energy markets. They expose the gap between command language and economic reality. A president can sound tough in public, but if a family is paying more every week to commute, heat their home, buy food, or move goods across the country, the public starts making its own judgment about competence. That is especially dangerous for a president whose political brand is built around affordability. Because affordability is not an abstract metric. It is emotional. It is the feeling that life is hard but still workable. It is the belief that effort still stretches far enough. When that belief breaks, anger takes its place. And energy prices are one of the fastest ways to break it. There is a broader strategic irony here. Washington can spend enormous energy managing military escalation abroad while losing political stability at home through the price system. That is one of the oldest lessons in political economy. Empires and administrations alike often underestimate the domestic consequences of external shocks. They think in terms of force projection, alliance management, and deterrence credibility. Voters think in terms of bills, wages, prices, and time. When those two timelines collide, the domestic one usually wins. So this is not just about Brent, gasoline futures, or inflation data. It is about whether the administration can sustain public confidence while energy becomes the vehicle through which war enters everyday American life. If that confidence holds, Trump keeps room to maneuver. If it breaks, the economic front becomes more dangerous than the military one. That is the U.S. economic trap in its purest form. A war sold as proof of strength can quickly become proof of exposure when oil, inflation, and household stress begin rewriting the political story from the ground up. The Washington front, power, money, and the crisis of legitimacy. Washington is now fighting a second war, and in some ways it may become the more dangerous one. The first war is in the Middle East, where missiles, energy infrastructure, and deterrence lines are colliding in real time. The second is in the American capital, where power, money, intelligence, and public trust are colliding just as violently, even if no buildings are burning. That second front matters because wars are not sustained by force alone. They are sustained by legitimacy. And once legitimacy starts to crack, even a powerful administration begins to look far less stable than it sounds. This is where the story turns inward. Reports that the Pentagon wants more than $200 billion to continue funding the war are not just budget headlines. They are warning flares. They tell us this is not being treated inside the system as a short, clean operation with a narrow endpoint. They tell us planners are thinking in terms of duration, scale, replenishment, and political endurance. In plain language, they are preparing for a war that could become much more expensive, much more prolonged, and much harder to justify to a public already feeling pressure at home. That matters because Donald Trump did not rise to power by promising Americans another massive foreign commitment. He built his political identity in part by attacking the failures of costly overseas adventures, by condemning elite misjudgment, and by speaking to a country exhausted by open-ended war. Now he is staring at the oldest trap in American statecraft: a president can campaign against other people's wars and still become the owner of his own. And ownership is exactly the issue. Once the price tag rises, once more funding is needed, once war powers debates intensify, the question stops being whether the administration can act. The question becomes whether it can persuade. That is a much harder test. Military force can be ordered quickly. Political consent cannot. It must be earned, maintained, and renewed under pressure. Right now, that pressure is rising from every direction at once. The biggest vulnerability is the justification itself. The administration has leaned heavily on the claim that Iran posed an imminent threat. That phrase is not a small detail. It is the legal, moral, and political hinge on which the case for war swings. If the threat was truly imminent, then the White House can argue urgency, necessity, and preemption. But if that case begins to look overstated, selective, or politically managed, then the entire structure of legitimacy weakens. That is why the responses from figures like Tulsi Gabbard and Joe Kent matter so much. Gabbard's unwillingness to clearly validate the administration's framing did not calm concerns. It deepened them. Kent's resignation and blunt rejection of the imminent threat argument made the split impossible to hide. Once that happens, the problem is no longer just factual. It becomes structural. The administration is no longer merely defending a military action. It is defending the credibility of its own decision-making process. And in Washington, credibility is a currency. When it weakens, everything gets more expensive, politically, institutionally, and strategically. This is where Congress enters the frame. The Senate's reluctance to impose meaningful limits on Trump's war powers may look, on paper, like a victory for executive flexibility. But it carries a deeper cost. When Congress steps back, the burden of discipline shifts even more heavily onto presidential judgment. That can look like strength in the short run. In reality, it often increases instability. A war run through broad executive discretion becomes more dependent on messaging, impulse control, and narrative management. That is not a recipe for democratic confidence. It is a recipe for brittleness masked as authority. There is also the money. War funding is never just about numbers on a page. It is about priorities, trade-offs, and the moral economy of public trust. Americans understand, even when officials hope they will not focus on it, that every massive request for war spending enters a domestic landscape already shaped by debt, inflation pressure, infrastructure needs, and social strain. That does not mean every dollar for defense is illegitimate. It means every dollar now has to fight harder for political acceptance. And if the public begins to suspect that the strategic rationale is weak while the bill is exploding, anger follows quickly. This is one of the oldest and most unforgiving lessons in democratic politics. A government can survive military risk more easily than it can survive a collapsing explanation. People will tolerate sacrifice when they believe the cause is necessary, the leadership is honest, and the mission is clear. They become far less patient when objectives blur, timelines stretch, and officials begin sounding evasive under scrutiny. At that point, the war is no longer judged only by outcomes abroad. It is judged by honesty at home. That is the deeper crisis forming in Washington now. It is not only about whether the United States can keep fighting. It is about whether the administration can keep the political center from fracturing under the combined weight of cost, contradiction, and doubt. Once those forces gather momentum, even very strong presidents start governing from a weaker foundation than they admit. So the Washington front is not secondary to this war. It is central to it. Because power without legitimacy becomes unstable. Spending without trust becomes toxic. Intelligence without confidence becomes a liability. And war without a persuasive public case eventually starts consuming the authority that launched it. When the rationale gets murky, the price gets larger, and the institutions meant to constrain power begin stepping back, Washington does not become more formidable. It becomes more exposed. What comes next? The three strategic paths and the most likely outcome. What comes next will not be decided by one speech, one missile volley, or one social media post. It will be decided by which pressure breaks first: military pressure, economic pressure, or political pressure. That is where this conflict stands now. The war has already crossed too many old limits to return to a stable status quo. The real question is not whether the danger is serious. The real question is what form the danger takes next, and which system fails under the strain first. There are three broad paths ahead, and each one carries a different kind of risk. The first path is controlled deterrence. In this scenario, Iran avoids another direct strike on Qatari energy infrastructure. Israel holds back from hitting South Pars again. Donald Trump's warning functions not as a prelude to action, but as a freezing mechanism. The United States uses threat posture to hold the line. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE strengthen defenses, tighten coordination, and try to prevent the conflict from dragging them into a direct regional war. Markets stay tense, prices stay elevated, but the panic does not fully break into a sustained supply collapse. This is the least destructive path, but nobody should confuse it with peace. It would be more like a crisis suspended in midair. The infrastructure remains vulnerable. The trust remains broken. The Gulf states remain exposed. The shipping lanes remain under stress. In that environment, calm is not the same as stability. It is only a pause in which everyone waits for the next test. Still, from a strategic standpoint, this is the path most governments would prefer, because it buys time and limits immediate systemic damage. The second path is an energy war spiral. This is the path that begins if Iran, or forces aligned with Iran, strike Gulf energy sites again, especially in Qatar, the UAE, or Saudi Arabia. If that happens, the logic of escalation becomes much harder to contain. The United States could feel compelled to act directly against South Pars, either in full or in some limited form that markets would still interpret as a major escalation. Israel would likely read renewed Gulf strikes as proof that broader pressure on Iran must intensify, not ease. Gulf states, under growing threat, could move from defensive language into active military coordination with Washington. That is the most dangerous path because it transforms a regional war into a long-duration attack on the energy architecture of the modern world. Hormuz would remain under intense stress. Insurance costs would rise again. LNG markets would price in longer repair and delivery risks. Oil could stay structurally high. Inflation pressure would deepen across import-dependent economies. And once that process hardens, it becomes very difficult to reverse quickly. The danger here is not just more explosions. It is the slow normalization of systemic instability. The third path is political fracture before military resolution. This path is less dramatic on television, but it may be just as decisive. In this scenario, the war keeps going, but support inside the United States weakens faster than strategic gains appear abroad. The funding burden grows. The intelligence rationale stays contested. Congress becomes more unstable. The administration's message loses coherence as it tries to balance deterrence, domestic affordability, and open-ended military risk all at once. America remains involved, but the clarity of its purpose starts to erode. This kind of fracture is especially dangerous because it produces force without strategic confidence. The war does not end, but the public case for it softens. Allies begin questioning durability. Adversaries begin testing resolve. Markets begin pricing not only military danger, but political inconsistency. In my experience, this is often where strong rhetoric begins to lose its effect. Not because the weapons disappear, but because the center holding the policy together starts weakening. So which path is most likely? My judgment is this: the most likely short-term outcome is unstable deterrence with recurring shocks. Not full regional collapse, not true de-escalation, but a tense and dangerous middle ground where no major actor wants total war, yet no major actor can fully restore trust either. That means more pressure, more volatility, more tests, and more moments when a single strike or misread signal could push the system off balance again. That is the future the world is staring at now. A conflict where the battlefield is no longer defined only by territory, but by tankers, terminals, gas fields, insurance prices, state credibility, and household cost. A conflict where the next move may come from Tehran, Jerusalem, Doha, or Washington, but the consequences will not stay there. Trump may believe he has drawn a line that restores deterrence. The harder truth is that once a war reaches the energy system, lines do not behave like walls. They behave like stress fractures. And history shows that stress fractures spread. In the end, this is the story of how a war stopped being only about weapons and started becoming a test of power, money, credibility, and survival. Donald Trump tried to draw a red line around Qatar's energy infrastructure. Israel struck South Pars. Iran retaliated across the Gulf. Ras Laffan burned. The Strait of Hormuz moved from background geography to the center of the global economic story. And Washington found itself fighting on two fronts at once, one in the Middle East, and one at home, where inflation, war costs, and political trust are all under pressure. What makes this story so powerful is that no one truly controls all of it anymore. Each actor is trying to impose order, but every move creates new instability somewhere else. Iran wants to show it cannot be cornered. Israel wants to prove no strategic asset is untouchable. Trump wants to project strength without losing control of the economic fallout. The Gulf states want security without total regional collapse. And ordinary people, especially in the United States, are left facing the oldest truth in political economy: when energy becomes a battlefield, the price is paid far beyond the front line. This is not just a story about leaders and threats. It is a story about how fragile modern life really is. A gas field, a tanker route, a missile strike, a budget request in Washington, all of these are now connected. That is the real lesson of this crisis. The deeper lesson for all of us is this: real power is never only about force. It is about resilience, judgment, discipline, and the ability to think 2 or 3 steps ahead while others are reacting emotionally. In everyday life, that means we should not wait for crises to expose our weaknesses. We should build margin before we need it. Financially, that means reducing waste, building savings, and preparing for shocks. Mentally, it means staying calm under pressure and learning to see causes, not just symptoms. Civically, it means asking harder questions when leaders make expensive decisions in our name. The people who survive unstable times best are not always the loudest or strongest. They are the ones who prepare, think clearly, and refuse to be manipulated by panic. Here's a quick question for you. What is the bigger danger in this crisis? A. Military escalation itself. B. The economic shock that spreads into everyday life. Comment A or B below. And what do you think overall? Do you believe Trump's red line can actually hold, or do you think this conflict is already moving beyond anyone's control? Share your view in the comments so everyone can read and learn from different perspectives. And subscribe to the channel to support our work and help keep these deep, hard-hitting analyses coming.